When passengers boarded the RMS Titanic in Southampton on April 10, 1912, they stepped into what was being called the largest moving object ever created by human hands. The ship represented the pinnacle of Edwardian luxury and engineering ambition. First-class passengers marveled at the grand staircase with its ornate oak paneling and wrought iron scrollwork. They dined in a palatial restaurant that rivaled the finest establishments in London or Paris. Second-class accommodations were so luxurious they exceeded first-class standards on most other ships of the era. Even third-class passengers, many of them immigrants seeking new lives in America, enjoyed amenities that were considered remarkably generous for steerage passage. The White Star Line had spared no expense in creating a floating palace that would dominate the transatlantic passenger trade for years to come. But beneath the polished wood, the electric lights, the Turkish baths, and the swimming pool, beneath even the modest third-class cabins where emigrants dream of American prosperity, there existed an entirely different world. This was a realm of darkness, heat, noise, and ceaseless labor. A labyrinth of passages, machinery spaces, cargo holds, and working areas that most passengers never saw and many never even knew existed. These were the hidden decks of the Titanic. The forgotten middle floors where the true operation of this massive vessel took place. While passengers above enjoyed afternoon tea and evening concerts, hundreds of crew members toiled in spaces that ranged from merely uncomfortable to absolutely hellish. The orlop deck, the tank top, the cargo holds, the boiler rooms, the engine spaces, and the miles of corridors known collectively as Scotland Road formed a secret city within the ship. This hidden world was essential to everything the Titanic represented. Without these spaces and the men who worked in them, the luxury above would have been impossible. The story of the Titanic is incomplete without understanding these forgotten decks, and the tragedy that befell the ship began in these very spaces, when ice met steel on that cold April night. The hidden decks tell a story of human ingenuity and labor, of class divisions and working conditions, of engineering marvels, and ultimately of fatal flaws. To truly understand the Titanic, we must ascend below the waterline, below the passenger decks, into the depths where few modern historians venture. We must explore the orlop deck where cargo was stored in near darkness, the tank top where steer and machinery lurked in cramped spaces, and Scotland Road, where crew members rushed through their endless duties. These spaces were photographed rarely, if at all, during the ship's brief existence, and much of what we know comes from ship plans, crew testimony, and recent exploration of the wreck site, lying 2.5 miles below the Atlantic surface. Understanding the Titanic's hidden decks requires first comprehending how this massive ship was structured from top to bottom. The vessel was not simply built like a multi-story building with one floor stacked atop another. Instead, it featured a complex system of decks, each serving specific purposes and housing different classes of passengers or ship operations. The uppermost level was the boat deck, an open area where the ship's lifeboats were stored in their davits, ready to be lowered in an emergency that most believed would never come. Below this came a deck, also called a promenade deck, which was the highest deck containing actual passenger accommodations and enclosed spaces. First-class passengers could stroll along covered promenades here, protected from Atlantic weather while enjoying ocean views. B deck, designated the bridge deck, contains some of the finest accommodations afloat, including the parlor suites that cost small fortunes to book. These suites featured private promenade decks, multiple bedrooms, and luxurious furnishings that rivaled any luxury hotel. C deck, the sheltered deck, continued with more first-class cabins, and importantly housed the main entrance for first-class passengers, where they would first step aboard and be greeted by stewards. D deck, known as the saloon deck, contained the first-class reception room and a magnificent dining saloon where hundreds dined each evening on elaborate multi-course meals. E deck, the upper deck, marked the beginning of the ship's more utilitarian character, though it still housed passenger cabins for all three classes. This deck also contained Scotland Road, the famous crew corridor that would become legendary. F deck, the middle deck, housed a swimming pool and Turkish baths for first-class passengers, but also contained a third-class dining saloon and numerous crew spaces. G deck, the lower deck, represented the lowest complete passenger accommodation level, housing third-class cabins, the squash racket court, and the post office where 5 postal clerks would sort mail during the voyage. But the ship did not end at G deck. Below this level existed partial decks and spaces that had no letter designation in passenger materials. The orlop deck consisted of discontinuous platforms and spaces between G deck above and the tank top below, existing primarily in the forward and aft sections of the vessel. The central portion at this level was dominated by the boiler rooms and engine spaces that rose through multiple deck levels. Finally, at the very bottom of the ship came the tank top, so named because it formed the top of the ship's double bottom. This lowest level provided access to steering machinery, anchor equipment, and the very bottom of the boiler and engine rooms. The orlop deck remains one of the most mysterious and least understood aspects of the Titanic's construction. The term orlop derives from the Dutch word overloop, meaning a covering or running over, and in naval architecture, it traditionally referred to the lowest deck of a sailing warship. On the Titanic, the orlop deck was not a complete continuous deck that ran the full length of the ship like the passenger decks above. Instead, it consisted of partial decking areas situated between G deck above and the tank top below, existing primarily in the forward bow section and the aft stern section of the vessel. The central portion of the ship at this level could not have a complete orlop deck, because this area was occupied by the massive boiler rooms and reciprocating engine rooms that extended down to the tank top and up through multiple deck levels. The orlop deck spaces that did exist served primarily as cargo holds, storage areas, and housing for some of the ship's essential auxiliary machinery. What made these spaces particularly eerie and forbidding was their almost complete isolation from the rest of the ship's functioning areas. While passengers many decks above enjoyed natural light streaming through large portholes and artificial illumination from the ship's extensive electrical system, the orlop deck existed in perpetual twilight, lit only by a handful of incandescent electric bulbs that cast long shadows across stored cargo and machinery. The air in these spaces was thick and oppressive, heavy with the smell of coal dust that permeated upward from the bunkers and boiler rooms below, mixed with the sharp scent of machine oil and the musty odor of stored goods, fabrics, and provisions. The orlop deck was not a place where crew members lingered or spent time unless their duties specifically required it. Few crew members had regular reason to venture into these spaces, and those who did often remarked on the oppressive atmosphere, the constant vibration of the engines that seemed more intense this far below the waterline, and the disconcerting sense of being in the belly of a great beast whose inner workings surrounded them on all sides. The temperature in the orlop deck areas varied dramatically depending on proximity to the boiler rooms. In forward storage areas, the temperature might be quite cold, especially in the refrigerated cargo holds that store meat and other perishables. But in areas adjacent to the boiler rooms, the temperature could soar despite the steel bulkheads separating the spaces. The orlop deck was truly a forgotten realm, a space that exists on the ship's plans, but which most passengers and even many crew members could not have accurately described or located. Even below the orlop deck, the Titanic continued downward to what was called the tank top, the absolute lowest complete level of the vessel. The tank top earned its name from its position, forming the top of the ship's double bottom, a crucial safety feature, where the hull was constructed with 2 layers of steel plating with space between them. This double-bottom construction meant that even if the outer hull was breached, the inner hull would theoretically maintain watertight integrity and prevent flooding. The space between the 2 hulls was divided into numerous compartments that could serve multiple purposes. Some were used as ballast tanks, which would be filled with seawater to adjust the ship's trim and stability. Others stored fresh water for drinking, cooking, and washing. Still others remained empty, simply providing that additional layer of protection against hull damage. The tank top itself was a relatively narrow space in most areas, often with headroom of only 5 or 6 feet, forcing any workers who entered these spaces to stoop as they moved through the dim corridors. This level existed primarily to provide access to the ship's most vital machinery that had to be positioned at the lowest possible point in the vessel. At the aft end of the tank top sat the steering gear, a massive system of hydraulic cylinders and mechanical linkages that translated the movements of the ship's wheel on the bridge, several decks and hundreds of feet above, into the physical turning of an enormous rudder. The steering gear room was a cramped space filled with gleaming brass and steel machinery, tended by crew members who had to ensure that the hydraulic pressure remained constant and that the mechanical systems operated smoothly. A failure of the steering gear would render the ship uncontrollable, making this one of the most critical spaces in the entire vessel. Forward on the tank top, in the extreme bow of the ship, sat the windlass machinery and anchor chain storage. The Titanic carried 3 anchors, 2 bower anchors on either side of the bow and a massive center anchor. The bower anchors each weighed nearly 8 tons, while the center anchor weighed an incredible 15 tons and required 20 horses to transport it to the shipyard. Each link of the anchor chains weighed over 175 pounds, and the chains themselves had to be stored somewhere when the anchors were raised. That somewhere was in the chain lockers accessible from the tank top, vast spaces where hundreds of feet of heavy chain lay coiled in the darkness, ready to pay out when the anchors were dropped. The windlass machinery that raised and lowered these massive anchors was powered by steam, with pipes running down from the boilers through the decks to supply the energy needed to lift tons of iron. Perhaps the most famous feature of the Titanic's hidden decks was Scotland Road, though technically this wasn't a separate deck at all, but rather a lengthy passageway on each deck. However, Scotland Road functioned as an arterial highway through the working heart of the ship, and its importance to the vessel's operation cannot be overstated. The passageway ran for nearly the entire length of the ship on the port side of E deck, a distance of over 400 feet, making it one of the longest uninterrupted corridors on any ship of the era. The nickname came from a notorious street in Liverpool, a working-class thoroughfare known for its constant bustle, grime, and activity. The Titanic's Scotland Road earned its name for similar reasons. This was where crew members rushed to and fro on their endless duties, where stewards carried supplies and meals, where third-class passengers navigated between their cabins and the dining areas. Unlike the carpeted and wood-paneled corridors of first class with their electric sconces and decorated ceilings, Scotland Road was purely functional in design and appearance. White-painted steel walls reflected the harsh light of bare electric bulbs. Exposed pipes and conduits ran along the ceiling, carrying steam, water, and electrical wiring to various parts of the ship. The floor was steel plating covered in linoleum for traction, and the constant sound of footsteps echoed off the hard surfaces, creating a din that never entirely ceased. Along Scotland Road's considerable length, dozens of doorways led to crew quarters, storage rooms, the post office, the squash racket court, and various ship services. Signs painted on the walls or mounted on the bulkheads directed crew members to different areas: steward's quarters, third-class dining saloon, post office, stores. It was a world unto itself, one that first-class passengers in the luxurious suites 5 decks above would never see and could scarcely imagine. The corridor had to be wide enough to allow crew members to pass each other while carrying supplies, luggage, or equipment. At certain points, it opened into slightly wider areas where staircases led up to D deck or down to F deck, allowing access to different levels of the ship. The contrast between Scotland Road and the passenger areas above was stark and deliberate. While passengers enjoyed carefully designed spaces meant to convey luxury, comfort, and stability, Scotland Road made no such pretensions. This was a working passage, designed for efficiency and functionality rather than aesthetics. Yet it was absolutely essential to the ship's operation, allowing crew members to move quickly through the vessel without constantly passing through passenger areas. The crew quarters on the Titanic's lower decks tell a story of stark class divisions and difficult working conditions that most modern workers would find appalling. While the ship's senior officers enjoyed relatively comfortable cabins with proper beds, writing desks, wardrobes, and adequate personal space, the vast majority of the crew lived in conditions that were cramped, noisy, and offered virtually no privacy. The ordinary crew members, including deck crew, firemen, trimmers, and greasers who actually operated and maintained the ship's machinery, were housed in dormitory-style spaces with metal bunk beds stacked 2 or even 3 high. These dormitories, located primarily on E and F decks toward the bow of the ship, often held a dozen or more men in a space not much larger than a modern living room. The bunks themselves were simple iron frames with thin mattresses and basic bedding. Privacy was completely non-existent, with men changing clothes, sleeping, and living their off-duty hours in full view of their roommates. Personal storage amounted to a small locker at the foot of each bunk, barely large enough for a change of clothes and a few personal items. Many crew members kept their most valuable possessions on their person at all times, simply because there was no secure place to store them. The noise in the crew quarters was relentless, and made restful sleep difficult even for exhausted workers. The quarters were positioned near the bow, where the rise and fall of the ship moving through ocean swells was most pronounced. The vibration from the engines, while not as intense as in the boiler rooms, was still constant and noticeable. Pipes running through the spaces carried steam and water, occasionally clanking or hissing. And of course, there was the sound of other crew members coming and going at all hours, as the ship operated on a 24-hour schedule, and different watches meant men were always either preparing for duty, returning from duty, or trying to sleep. The stewards and stewardesses who served the passengers and maintained the public spaces had slightly better accommodations than the engine room crew, but their quarters were still tiny cabins with shared washing facilities. A typical steward's cabin might measure 8 feet by 6 feet and contain 2 bunks, giving each occupant a space about the size of a modern closet. Stewardesses, the women who attended to female passengers in clean cabins, had similar cramped quarters, usually located on E-deck, where they would be close to the passenger areas they served. What's particularly striking about the positioning of the crew quarters is that many were located in the bow of the ship, which would prove catastrophic during the sinking. The bow was chosen for crew quarters partly because it was the least desirable space in terms of motion and comfort, with passengers preferring the more stable midship and stern locations. But this meant that when the Titanic struck the iceberg, the crew quarters were among the first spaces to flood. The cargo holds of the Titanic represented another crucial component of the ship's hidden decks and a significant source of revenue for the White Star Line. While passengers and their comfort were certainly important, the Titanic was also very much a working cargo vessel, carrying freight and mail across the Atlantic. The forward cargo holds, located in the bow below the crew quarters and accessible from the orlop deck and G-deck, contained an eclectic mix of goods that reflected the international trade of the era. The White Star Line charged freight rates based on weight, volume, and the nature of the cargo, with special rates for particularly valuable or fragile items. The cargo manifest of the Titanic's maiden voyage listed everything from bundles of oakum and leather hides to expensive automobiles being shipped to wealthy American buyers. One of the most valuable items in the cargo holds was a jeweled copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a book bound in gold and encrusted with precious stones, worth thousands of pounds sterling at 1912 values. Several automobiles were also being transported, including a Renault-type CB Coupe de Ville that belonged to a passenger. These cars had to be carefully loaded and secured, as any shifting during rough seas could cause damage. The forward cargo holds were numbered 1 through 6, progressing from the bow backward toward the midship section. Each hold was a cavernous space when empty, with steel walls and floors and minimal lighting. Cargo was loaded through large hatches on the deck above, with cranes lowering goods down to waiting workers who would secure everything in place using ropes, chains, and wooden blocks to prevent shifting. The logistics of loading cargo were staggering and required careful planning. Heavy items had to be placed low in the holds to maintain the ship's center of gravity and ensure stability. The distribution of weight fore and aft also had to be balanced to maintain proper trim. Fragile cargo needed to be protected from crushing by heavier items stacked above, and perishable goods needed to be located near the refrigerated storage areas. The aft cargo holds, located in the stern section of the ship and also accessible via cargo hatches, contained different types of freight. These spaces held wines and spirits destined for American customers, machinery parts for industrial operations, and various manufactured goods being exported from Britain to America. The aft holds were somewhat easier to access than the forward holds and were generally used for cargo that might need to be unloaded more quickly upon arrival in New York. When the Titanic struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, the forward cargo holds were among the first spaces to flood completely. Cargo hold number 1, the furthest forward, filled with icy seawater within minutes of the collision. Hold number 2 followed within 15 minutes. One of the most impressive yet hidden systems aboard the Titanic was a network of refrigeration and food storage facilities required to feed over 2,200 people for a week at sea. The ship needed to carry enormous quantities of provisions, particularly given that first-class passengers expected to dine on multiple elaborate courses at every meal, with menus that rival the finest restaurants in London or Paris. The provision manifest of the Titanic's maiden voyage listed staggering quantities of food, 75,000 pounds of fresh meat, 11,000 pounds of fresh fish, 40,000 fresh eggs, 40 tons of potatoes, 7,000 heads of lettuce, 10,000 pounds of sugar, 1,500 gallons of milk, and much more. All of this had to be stored, kept fresh, and properly managed to ensure that meals could be prepared throughout the voyage. The ship featured several large refrigerated storage rooms on F and G decks, massive insulated chambers where meat, fish, poultry, and dairy products were stored at near-freezing temperatures. The refrigeration system itself was a marvel of early 20th century engineering, using a compression refrigeration system with carbon dioxide as the refrigerant. The machinery for the system, including large compressors and condensers, was located on the orlop deck and tank top levels, adding to the labyrinth of pipes, pumps, and mechanical equipment in those spaces. The compressors were powered by the ship's electrical system and had to run continuously to maintain the proper temperature in the refrigerated rooms. The refrigerated storage rooms were kept locked and under the supervision of specific crew members who had the responsibility of managing the ship's provisions. These men, working under the chief victualler, maintained careful records of what was stored and what was being used, ensuring that supplies would last the entire voyage with appropriate amounts left over for the return journey that never happened. During the voyage, these crew members would enter the frigid chambers multiple times per day, their breath visible in the cold air, selecting the specific meats, fish, and other perishables required by the chef preparing meals in the galley's many decks above. The contrast in temperature between the refrigerated storage rooms and the nearby boiler rooms was extreme and sometimes surreal. The refrigerated rooms maintained temperatures around 35 degrees Fahrenheit, while just a few steel bulkheads away, the boiler rooms could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. This created strange microclimates in the ship's lower decks, where crew members might move from near-freezing temperatures to oppressive heat within just a few steps. The insulation for the refrigerated rooms was substantial, with thick cork panels lining the walls and heavy doors with rubber seals to maintain the cold temperatures and prevent warm air from entering. The boiler rooms of the Titanic were perhaps the most dramatic and demanding spaces in the entire vessel, representing both the pinnacle of marine engineering and absolutely hellish working conditions. These massive spaces were not tucked away in forgotten corners, but rather dominated the center of the ship, extending from the tank top level up through several decks. The Titanic had 29 boilers arranged in 6 separate boiler rooms, each boiler containing 3 furnaces for a total of 159 individual furnaces that required constant feeding with coal. Each boiler was a massive cylindrical structure, approximately 20 feet long and nearly 16 feet in diameter, weighing many tons even when empty. The boilers operated on the principle of heating water to create steam under high pressure, which was then piped to the engines that drove the propellers. Maintaining the correct steam pressure required keeping the furnaces burning at precise temperatures, which in turn required an endless supply of coal and constant attention from the stokers who tended them. The boiler rooms were accessed from the tank top level and rose upward to what would have been the orlop deck level, with the tops of the boilers reaching nearly to G deck. Each boiler room was separated from the next by a watertight bulkhead, one of the ship's key safety features. These bulkheads extended from the tank top up to E deck and could be closed either manually using large wheel mechanisms or automatically by sensors that detected water entering the ship. When closed, these watertight doors theoretically sealed off each boiler room from its neighbors, allowing the ship to survive flooding in several compartments. The work in the boiler rooms was quite possibly the most grueling labor on the vessel, work that would break most modern people within an hour. Firemen, as the stokers were called, worked 4-hour shifts in heat that regularly exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. They shoveled coal from bunkers at the sides of each boiler room into wheelbarrows or buckets, then wheeled or carried it to furnaces before flinging it into the roaring flames. The technique required skill and experience to distribute the coal evenly across the furnace grate and maintain the correct temperature. A skilled fireman could read the color and intensity of the flames to know exactly how much coal to add and when. Trimmers worked alongside the firemen, their job being to move coal from the larger storage bunkers further away to keep the supplies near the boilers well stocked. As coal was consumed from the bunkers nearest the furnaces, gaps and voids appeared that had to be filled from deeper in the bunker. Trimmers would climb into these dark spaces with shovels and wheelbarrows, moving ton after ton of coal in the stifling heat. The noise in the boiler rooms was absolutely deafening, a combination of roaring flames, the constant clang of shovels on steel, the rumble of coal being dumped, and the hiss of steam. Verbal communication was nearly impossible, with workers relying on hand signals and simply knowing their jobs well enough that minimal coordination was needed. After the boiler rooms lay the engine rooms, occupying massive spaces on the tank top and orlop deck, levels roughly below, with a first-class smoking room. An aft grand staircase sat many decks above. Here stood the Titanic's reciprocating engines, two 4-story-tall monsters of gleaming steel and polished brass that represented the pinnacle of marine engineering for the era. Each engine weighed hundreds of tons and converted the steam pressure generated by the boilers into the rotating motion that turned the ship's wing propellers. The reciprocating engines operated on a triple expansion principle, meaning the steam passed through 3 different cylinders of increasing size, extracting as much energy as possible from the steam before it was exhausted. The cylinders themselves were massive, with the low-pressure cylinders measuring nearly 10 feet in diameter. The pistons were then moved up and down with tremendous force, connected to a crankshaft that converted the linear motion into rotation. The engineering was precise to tolerances of fractions of an inch, despite the massive scale of the components. Between the 2 reciprocating engines sat a low-pressure turbine engine, a more modern design that extracted additional power from the exhaust steam of the main engines. This turbine turned the central propeller and represented the cutting edge of marine propulsion technology. The combination of reciprocating engines and a turbine allowed the Titanic to extract maximum efficiency from the steam generated by burning coal, making the ship faster and more economical to operate than if it had used reciprocating engines alone. The engine rooms were slightly less infernally hot than the boiler rooms, as the steam had already lost much of its thermal energy by the time it reached the engines. However, the temperature was still oppressive, regularly exceeding 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and the humidity from steam leaks made the air thick and difficult to breathe. The noise was incredible, perhaps even worse than in the boiler rooms. The constant rhythmic pounding of the massive pistons moving up and down created a deep bass rumble that could be felt as much as heard. The rush of steam through pipes, the clank of machinery, and the whir of the turbine combined into a cacophony that made verbal communication essentially impossible. Engineers and greasers constantly moved about these spaces, checking gauges that monitored steam pressure, temperature, and engine speed. They adjusted valves to regulate steam flow, ensuring the engines operated at the speed commanded by the bridge. Perhaps most importantly, they lubricated the countless moving parts that kept the engines running smoothly. The term greaser was literal. These crew members carried cans of lubricating oil and regularly applied it to bearings, joints, and sliding surfaces. Without constant lubrication, the massive engines would quickly seize up from friction and heat. The Titanic's electrical systems and their associated machinery spaces represent another crucial but often overlooked aspect of the hidden decks. The ship was one of the most advanced vessels of its era in terms of electrical systems, featuring electric lighting throughout, electric elevators for first-class passengers, electric heaters, electrically operated watertight doors, and numerous other electrical conveniences. All of this required tremendous amounts of electrical power, far more than any battery system could provide. The ship had its own power plant consisting of 4 massive steam-powered dynamos that generated electrical current for distribution throughout the vessel. These dynamos, each weighing many tons, were located in a dedicated engine room on the tank top level, positioned aft of the main reciprocating engines. Each dynamo consisted of a steam engine that drove an electrical generator, converting steam power into electrical power. The steady thrum of these generators provided power throughout the ship. Their importance to the vessel's operation cannot be overstated. When passengers switched on electric lights in their cabins, when the wireless operators transmitted messages from the Marconi room, when the elevators carried first-class passengers between decks, the power came from these dynamos operating in the depths of the ship. The electrical system was designed with redundancy and robustness in mind, with multiple dynamos operating simultaneously, so that even if one or more failed, the others could maintain essential power. The electrical distribution system was complex, with massive switchboards in the electrical engine room that allowed engineers to route power to different parts of the ship as needed. During the sinking, this redundancy proved crucial and perhaps added hours to how long people had to evacuate. The lights on the Titanic remained lit almost until the very end, approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes after the collision, allowing passengers and crew to navigate the tilting corridors and enabling the wireless operators to continue sending distress calls that ultimately summoned the Carpathia to rescue survivors. The engineering crew that maintained these electrical systems remained at their posts throughout the disaster, keeping the generators running even as water rose around them. Their dedication kept the lights burning, the wireless operating, and electrically operated watertight doors functioning, giving hundreds of people a better chance at survival. The electrical engineers knew that abandoning their posts would plunge the ship into darkness and chaos, so they stayed, adjusting systems and keeping power flowing even when it became clear the ship was doomed. Most of these engineers perished. Their bodies never recovered from the depths. The Titanic's electrical system was also responsible for powering numerous auxiliary systems that passengers never directly saw, but which were essential to the ship's operation. Electric motors drove pumps that circulated water for cooling, that supplied water pressure throughout the vessel, and that attempted to pump out flooding water after the collision. Electric motors operated ventilation fans that brought fresh air into the boiler rooms and engine spaces. One of the most poignant spaces in the Titanic's hidden decks was the postal sorting room and mail storage areas. The ship carried mail under contract with the British Royal Mail and the United States Postal Service, making it a Royal Mail ship and earning the RMS designation that preceded its name. This was not simply a courtesy title. The ship was legally obligated to carry and protect the mail, and postal operations were taken extremely seriously by both the White Star Line and the 5 postal clerks who worked aboard. The postal sorting room was located on G deck in the forward part of the ship, positioned relatively low in the vessel to be near the cargo holds where additional mail bags were stored. The room itself was a dedicated workspace with sorting bins, scales, and work tables where the clerks processed mail. 2 of the postal clerks were British, employed by the General Post Office, while 3 were American, employed by the U.S. Postal Service. These men worked throughout the voyage, sorting through hundreds of thousands of letters and parcels, organizing them by destination, so they could be efficiently distributed upon arrival in New York. The postal operation on the Titanic was substantial, with the ship carrying approximately 3,400 bags of mail, containing an estimated 400,000 pieces of correspondence. Much of this mail was stored in cargo spaces on the orlop deck directly below the sorting room, with the postal clerks accessing these storage areas via a dedicated staircase. The mail ranged from simple personal letters to valuable documents, contracts, and parcels containing goods. The postal clerks took their duties with utmost seriousness, aware that they were responsible for property worth considerable sums, and that people depended on timely delivery of correspondence. When the Titanic struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m., the postal sorting room on G deck was among the first occupied spaces to begin flooding. The 5 postal clerks were likely awake and working when the collision occurred, as they often worked late into the night processing mail. Within minutes, they would have noticed water entering their workspace. Witnesses who survived later reported seeing the postal clerks desperately working to move mail bags up the stairs to higher decks, attempting to save as much of the mail as possible from the rising water. It was a futile effort given the rate at which water was flooding into the forward section of the ship, but the clerks continued their efforts even as the situation became increasingly dire. All 5 postal clerks died in the disaster. None of them made it into a lifeboat, and their bodies were never recovered from the sea. It's likely they continued working to save the mail until water levels forced them from the sorting room, by which point it may have been too late to reach the boat deck. The Squash Racket Court, a recreational facility for first-class passengers, was located adjacent to the post office on G deck. This court, which lay even deeper in the ship's hull, was one of the first recreational spaces to completely flood. The plumbing and sanitation systems of the Titanic required extensive infrastructure throughout the hidden decks, representing yet another layer of the ship's complex internal systems. Modern cruise ships have sophisticated sewage treatment facilities, but in 1912 the solution was simpler though less environmentally friendly. The ship's waste systems relied primarily on gravity and seawater pressure rather than complex pumping and treatment. Toilets and sinks throughout the ship drained through a complex network of pipes that ran down to the decks, passing through the orlop deck areas and eventually terminating in discharge ports below the waterline, where waste was simply released into the ocean. The pipes and valves for these systems, along with the freshwater distribution networks, occupied significant space on the orlop deck and tank top, maintained by dedicated plumbers and pipe fitters among the crew. These men spent their working hours in the hidden spaces of the ship, accessing cramped areas behind walls and beneath floors to repair leaks, clear blockages, and ensure the systems functioned properly. The freshwater system was particularly complex and critically important to the ship's operation. The Titanic carried fresh water in large tanks located in the double-bottom compartments, accessible from the tank top level. This fresh water was drawn from these storage tanks by electric pumps and distributed through pipes to supply drinking water, washing water, and water for the galleys where meals were prepared and the bathrooms where passengers bathed. The system had to maintain adequate pressure throughout the ship so that water would flow properly even on the highest decks. Separate systems provided salt water for specific uses. Salt water was used in many of the lavatories to conserve fresh water and was also used for various shipboard cleaning and maintenance purposes. Salt water was essentially free and unlimited, drawn directly from the ocean by pumps and distributed where needed. The steam heating system that kept the ship warm during the North Atlantic crossing also required extensive piping throughout the hidden decks. Steam from the boilers was distributed through insulated pipes to radiators in passenger cabins and public spaces. The system had to be carefully balanced so that all areas received adequate heat without any spaces becoming too hot. Valves throughout the system allowed crew members to regulate steam flow to different areas of the ship. During the Titanic's final hours, these various systems created additional complications. As the ship sailed by the bow, water pressure in the pipes changed, causing some systems to fail while others continued operating in unexpected ways. The freshwater system likely remained operational longer than might be expected because the storage tanks were in the double bottom, which remained relatively intact in the stern section until near the end. The electrical pumps that supplied water pressure continued operating as long as the dynamos kept running. However, as more compartments flooded and the ship's angle increased, maintaining proper system operation became impossible. The ventilation systems that brought fresh air to interior spaces also involved significant infrastructure in the hidden decks. Large ventilation trunks ran vertically through the ship, drawing fresh air from intakes on the upper decks and distributing it to interior spaces that had no portholes or direct access to outside air. Electric fans at various points in the system forced air movement, ensuring that even the deepest interior spaces received some fresh air circulation. When the Titanic struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, 1912, the hidden decks immediately became the focal point of the disaster. The iceberg opened the hull plates along the starboard side and the forward section of the ship, creating a series of gashes and separations that allowed seawater to pour into the lowest levels of the vessel. Within minutes, the tank top and orlop deck spaces in the forward section were flooding with icy Atlantic water. The forepeak, the very foremost compartment, flooded almost immediately. Cargo holds 1, 2, and 3 rapidly filled with water. Boiler Room 6, one of the forward boiler rooms, began flooding as water poured to the damaged hull plates. The watertight doors between the boiler rooms closed, either automatically triggered by sensors that detected water or manually operated by crew members following orders from the bridge. But the damage was too extensive for these safety measures to be effective. The ship had been designed to survive flooding in the first 4 compartments, or any 2 adjacent compartments. Naval architect Thomas Andrews, who was aboard for the maiden voyage, quickly examined the damage reports and performed calculations. He determined that the ship had breached 5, possibly 6 compartments. As water filled these forward spaces, the weight would inevitably drag the bow down, causing water to spill over the tops of the watertight bulkheads into the next compartment, then the next, in an unstoppable progression. Andrews informed Captain Smith that the ship had perhaps an hour to an hour and a half before it would sink completely. The hidden decks, so essential to the ship's operation, now became death traps for crew members working there. Those in the forward sections had to navigate flooding corridors, sealed watertight doors, and unfamiliar passages to escape. The crew quarters in the bow, positioned on the lowest complete decks, flooded quickly, Crew members sleeping off duty when the collision occurred woke to find icy water already pouring into their spaces, giving them precious little time to gather belongings or even fully dress before fleeing upward toward the deck. In the boiler rooms and engine spaces, crew members face an agonizing decision. Staying at their posts meant maintaining power and keeping pumps operating, which could slow the flooding and keep the ship's lights burning, helping evacuation efforts. But staying also meant reducing their own chances of escape as the water rose and their path to the upper decks became cut off. Many chose to stay. Firemen continued feeding furnaces to maintain steam pressure. Engineers adjusted valves and monitored gauges. Electricians kept the dynamos running. Slowly, as different areas flooded and became untenable, these crew members would retreat aft and upward, maintaining operations in one boiler room after abandoning the next as water levels rose. The engineering officers moved to the flooding spaces, assessing damage and organizing the crew. They opened emergency valves to relieve pressure, started additional pumps to slow flooding, and made the critical decision to keep the electrical generators running as long as possible. Chief Engineer Joseph Bell and his senior staff remained below decks throughout the sinking, supervising operations until the very end. The legacy of the Titanic's hidden decks extends far beyond the ship itself into maritime safety regulations, ship design principles, and our understanding of a disaster. When Dr. Robert Ballard discovered the wreck in 1985, lying in two main sections on the Atlantic floor at a depth of over 12,000 feet, subsequent exploration gradually focused more attention on the less glamorous but equally important sections of the vessel. As technology improved and multiple expeditions visited the wreck site using increasingly sophisticated submersibles and remote-operated vehicles, researchers examined the hidden decks, or what remained of them after 7 decades of deterioration and the catastrophic forces that tore the ship apart. The debris field between the two main pieces of the wreck contains thousands of objects that fell from the ship as it broke apart or were blown out of the interior by the implosion of air-filled spaces as the stern section sank. Many of these objects came from the hidden decks. Lumps of coal from the bunkers, machinery components from the engine rooms, sections of pipe from the plumbing systems, and portions of the refrigeration equipment have been photographed on the ocean floor. The bow section of the wreck, while heavily damaged by decades of deterioration, still shows evidence of the complex multi-level nature of the hidden decks. Submersibles have penetrated into some of these spaces, capturing haunting images of machinery still in place, of corridors and compartments that haven't seen daylight since 1912. What exploration has revealed is that the hidden decks suffered catastrophic damage during the sinking. When the bow section flooded completely and the stern rose into the air, reaching an angle approaching vertical, the stress on the ship's structure became unbearable. The break occurred around the area between the aft boiler rooms and the engine room, right at the orlop deck and tank top levels. The ship tore apart with tremendous force, shredding the hidden decks and exposing their contents to the sea. The disaster prompted wholesale changes in maritime safety regulations. Investigations examined every aspect of the ship's design and operation, including the arrangement of watertight compartments, the location of crew quarters, and the survivability of different sections. Several key lessons emerged that influenced ship design for decades. Watertight bulkheads were extended higher to prevent water from spilling over the top. The location of crew quarters was reconsidered, as placing in the extreme bow on the lowest decks was recognized as a significant survival liability. Emergency power systems became mandatory to ensure lighting and communication would remain operational even if the main power plant was compromised. The story of the Titanic's secret decks is ultimately a human story. It's the story of coal trimmers and firemen working in unbearable heat, postal clerks who prioritized their duty over survival, and engineers who kept the lights burning as water rose around them. These hidden spaces were not afterthoughts, but the foundation upon which everything else rested. When that foundation was compromised, the entire structure was doomed. What secrets lie beneath the Titanic's forgotten middle floors? They tell us that behind every luxury, there is labor. Behind every achievement of engineering, there are human beings working in difficult conditions. And they remind us that the most important parts of any complex system are often the parts we never see. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching.